In the bustling city of Lagos, Nigeria, Mrs. Amaka, a wealthy and elegant woman, decided to test the honesty of her new maid, Chidinma. To do this, Mrs. Amaka left her safe, filled with priceless jewels, open while she went out for a meeting. Through the security camera, Mrs. Amaka watched as Chidinma noticed the open safe, hesitated, but ultimately chose to close it without taking anything. However, just when Mrs. Amaka felt relieved, she discovered something alarming. The camera footage revealed Chidinma retrieving a mysterious envelope from under a rug after closing the safe. Inside the envelope was a threatening note, which plunged Chidinma into a dangerous situation. That night, Mrs. Amaka followed Chidinma to an old warehouse, where a shadowy figure handed her another note. Realizing they were being watched and tracked, Mrs. Amaka and Chidinma tried to flee, only to receive a chilling message that forced them to turn back. As they drove through the dark streets of Lagos, a thick fog enveloped the road, and they encountered a large, dark figure standing in their path. The car's headlights flickered out, leaving them in complete darkness as the timer on a mysterious phone hit 0. The heavy silence was broken only by the sound of their breathing, rapid and shallow. Mrs. Amaka's hands gripped the steering wheel tightly, her eyes straining to see through the thick fog that had swallowed them whole. The dark figure that had blocked their path was still there, unmoving, like a shadow cast by something far more sinister. "What do we do now, madam?" Chidinma's voice was barely a whisper, her fear evident in the tremble of her words. Mrs. Amaka's mind raced. The figure was too large to be just a person. There was something unnatural about it, something that sent a chill down her spine. But she knew they couldn't stay in the car forever. They had to move, to do something before whatever was out there decided to make its move. Just as Mrs. Amaka was about to suggest they try to reverse and find another route, the phone in Chidinma's lap buzzed again. This time, the screen didn't display a countdown, but a single message. "Step out and face your fate." Mrs. Amaka swallowed hard. They had no idea who or what was controlling the events that were unfolding, but it was clear that they were in the grip of something far beyond their control. The only option was to do as the message said. "Stay close to me, Chidinma," Mrs. Amaka instructed, her voice steady despite the fear gnawing at her insides. "We're going to face this together." Slowly, they pushed open the car doors, the cold night air rushing in. The fog seemed to thicken around them, the eerie silence amplifying every sound: their footsteps on the pavement, the rustle of leaves, the distant hum of the city that now felt a world away. As they stepped out, the figure in the road began to move toward them, its shape becoming clearer. It was a man, tall and broad-shouldered, his face hidden in the shadows of a hooded cloak. He stopped a few feet in front of them, his presence imposing, as if he could see straight into their souls. "Who are you?" Mrs. Amaka demanded, summoning all the authority she could muster. The man didn't answer. Instead, he reached into his cloak and pulled out a small, old-fashioned key, holding it out for them to see. "You've been chosen," he said in a deep, gravelly voice. "What happens next depends on your choices." Mrs. Amaka exchanged a worried glance with Chidinma, who clung to her side, her eyes wide with fear. "Chosen for what?" Mrs. Amaka asked, trying to keep her voice steady. The man didn't reply. He simply placed the key on the ground in front of them and began to walk away, disappearing into the fog as quickly as he had appeared. They were left standing there, the key gleaming in the dim light, its purpose and meaning a mystery. "Should we take it?" Chidinma asked, her voice quivering. Mrs. Amaka hesitated. Everything about this felt like a trap, but they had come too far to turn back now. With a deep breath, she bent down and picked up the key, feeling its cold metal against her skin. The moment she did, the fog around them seemed to lift slightly, revealing a narrow path that had been hidden before. The path led deeper into the city, toward an area that Mrs. Amaka recognized but had never ventured into, a place known for its secrets and the dark deals that happened there. "We need to follow the path," Mrs. Amaka said, her voice firm. "Whatever this is, we have to see it through." Together, they started down the path, their steps echoing in the quiet night. Every shadow seemed to shift as they passed, and the sense of being watched never left them. The city, once so familiar, now felt like an alien world where anything could happen. As they neared the end of the path, they found themselves standing in front of an old, decrepit building. It was a place that had long been abandoned, its windows boarded up, and the walls covered in graffiti. The door was slightly ajar, as if inviting them in. Mrs. Amaka clutched the key tightly. "This is it," she whispered. They pushed the door open and stepped inside. The air was thick with dust, and the only light came from the moon, streaming through the cracks in the boarded-up windows. At the far end of the room was a large, ornate chest, its surface covered in strange symbols that glowed faintly in the dark. Without a word, Mrs. Amaki approached the chest and inserted the key into the lock. With a soft click, the chest opened, revealing something that neither of them had expected. Inside was a single item, a small, ancient-looking book bound in dark leather. The pages were yellowed with age, and as Mrs. Amaka lifted it out, she felt a strange energy emanating from it. "This can't be real," Chidinma murmured, her eyes wide with disbelief. But it was real, and as they opened the book, they realized it was no ordinary book. The pages were filled with strange symbols and drawings, but also with words written in a language neither of them could understand. Yet, as they stared at the pages, the words began to shift, forming a message in English, clear and ominous. "The key to your salvation lies within. But beware, for once the book is opened, it cannot be closed. Your journey has only just begun." The room seemed to grow darker, the air heavier, as if the very walls were closing in on them. Mrs. Amaka felt a chill run down her spine as she realized that by opening the chest, they had set something in motion, something that couldn't be stopped. Before she could say anything, the door behind them slammed shut, plunging the room into complete darkness. And then, from the shadows, they heard a whisper, soft at first, but growing louder, more insistent, as if coming from all around them. "You should never have come here." The darkness was suffocating. Mrs. Amaka's heart pounded in her chest as the whispering voices swirled around them, growing louder and more menacing with every passing second. Chidinma clung to her arm, trembling, her breath coming in shallow gasps. The book in Mrs. Amaka's hands seemed to pulse with an eerie energy, as if alive and aware of the fear it had instilled in them. "Madam, what do we do?" Chidinma's voice was barely a whisper, filled with terror. Mrs. Amaka swallowed hard, trying to steady her thoughts. "We need to find a way out of here," she replied, her voice firm despite the dread clawing at her. "We can't let this, whatever it is, control us." But even as she said the words, she knew that the situation was far beyond anything they could have prepared for. The air felt thick, as if the room itself was closing in on them, and the whispers, those awful, disembodied whispers, seemed to be coming from everywhere at once. The book, still in her hands, drew her attention once more. The pages fluttered open on their own, revealing more strange symbols that slowly morphed into words she could understand. "The only way out is to embrace the darkness. Find the light hidden within." Mrs. Amaka frowned, the cryptic message offering little comfort. But it was all they had to go on. "Chidinma, we need to look for something, a light, maybe a candle or a torch. There must be something in here." They began to fumble around in the dark, their hands brushing against cold, dusty surfaces as they searched. Every creak of the old building, every shift in the shadows, made them jump. The whispers, though still present, seemed to be receding slightly, as if waiting for them to make the next move. Suddenly, Chidinma's hand brushed against something cold and metallic. "I found something," she exclaimed softly, her voice tinged with hope. She pulled it out from under a pile of debris. It was a small, ornate lantern, the kind used in ancient times. Mrs. Amaka quickly took the lantern and examined it. There was a tiny compartment at the base, which she opened to find a single matchstick tucked inside. "This must be it," she whispered, almost in disbelief. The light hidden within. With trembling hands, she struck the match against the rough surface of the lantern. The tiny flame sputtered to life, casting a dim, flickering light that barely penetrated the darkness. But it was enough to see by, and as the light grew steadier, the whispers seemed to fade even more, retreating to the edges of the room. They could now make out more of their surroundings. The walls were lined with old, decaying bookshelves, and in the center of the room was a large, circular symbol carved into the floor. The symbol was unlike anything Mrs. Amaka had ever seen, with intricate patterns that seemed to pulse with a faint, otherworldly glow. "What is this place?" Chidinma asked, her eyes wide with fear as she stared at the symbol. "I don't know," Mrs. Amaka replied, her voice filled with unease. "But I think it's part of whatever we're caught up in." As they stepped closer to the symbol, the book in Mrs. Amaka's hands began to hum softly, its pages glowing with the same light as the symbol on the floor. It was as if the book and the symbol were connected, two pieces of a puzzle they were meant to solve. "I think we have to place the book in the center," Mrs. Amaka said, feeling a strange compulsion to do so. She knelt down and carefully set the book within the circle, its light merging with the glow of the symbol. The moment she did, the entire room seemed to come alive. The symbol flared brightly, and the walls around them began to shift and change, revealing hidden passages that had been concealed in the darkness. The whispers, now distant, were replaced by a low, rumbling sound, like the growl of some ancient beast waking from its slumber. "Madam, look!" Chidinma pointed to one of the newly revealed passages, where a faint light was emanating from within. It was warm and inviting, a stark contrast to the oppressive darkness they had been surrounded by. "We need to follow that light," Mrs. Amaka decided, her voice resolute. "Whatever lies at the end of this path, it's the only way forward." They walked cautiously toward the passage, the lantern casting long shadows on the walls as they moved. The rumbling sound grew louder with each step, and the ground beneath them began to tremble, as if the entire building was on the verge of collapsing. As they entered the passage, the light grew brighter, revealing a long, narrow corridor that seemed to stretch on endlessly. The walls were lined with ancient carvings, depicting scenes of rituals and sacrifices, of people offering up strange objects to beings that were neither human nor animal. "What kind of place is this?" Chidinma whispered, her voice shaking. Mrs. Amaka had no answer. The corridor seemed to defy logic, twisting and turning in ways that made it impossible to tell which direction they were going. The air grew colder, and the light at the end of the passage flickered, as if struggling to stay alive. Just when it seemed like they would never reach the end, the corridor suddenly opened up into a vast chamber. The ceiling was high and vaulted, supported by massive pillars that were carved with the same strange symbols as the ones they had seen earlier. At the far end of the chamber was an altar, and on the altar lay a single object, a small, intricately carved box, similar in design to the book they had found earlier. Mrs. Amaka felt a pull toward the altar, a sense that this box held the key to everything they had experienced so far. But as they approached it, the rumbling sound reached a deafening crescendo, and the ground beneath their feet began to crack and split open. "Madam, we have to get out of here!" Chidinma screamed, her voice barely audible over the chaos. But Mrs. Amaka couldn't move. Her eyes were locked on the box, her mind filled with a singular thought. "This is what they wanted us to find." The cracks in the floor widened, and from the darkness below, a blinding light erupted, filling the chamber with a searing heat. The pillars began to crumble, and the walls shook violently, sending chunks of stone crashing to the ground. Just as it seemed like the entire chamber was about to collapse, Mrs. Amaka reached out and grabbed the box. The moment she did, the light intensified, and everything around them dissolved into blinding whiteness. And then, just as suddenly, the light vanished, leaving them in complete darkness once more. A voice, calm and composed, echoed through the void. "You have taken the first step. The journey ahead is perilous, but you cannot turn back now. The truth you seek is buried deep within the shadows, and only by embracing them can you find the answers you desire." Mrs. Amaka and Chidinma were left standing in the darkness, the box in Mrs. Amaka's hands glowing faintly with an inner light. The chamber was gone, replaced by an endless expanse of blackness that stretched out in all directions. "What do we do now?" Chidinma asked, her voice trembling with fear. Mrs. Amaka didn't have an answer. The only thing she knew for certain was that they had crossed a threshold, stepping into a world where nothing was as it seemed, and the path ahead was shrouded in mystery and danger. With no other choice, they began to move forward, the faint glow of the box their only guide in the darkness. But as they took their first steps, a chilling realization set in: they were not alone. From the shadows, they heard it again, the soft, insistent whisper that had haunted them from the beginning. "You should never have come here." The darkness was thick and impenetrable, pressing in on Mrs. Amaka and Chidinma from all sides. The only thing that pierced the black void was the faint glow emanating from the small box in Mrs. Amaka's hands. It was their only source of light, their only connection to the world they had left behind. The whispering voice that had haunted them since the beginning grew louder, echoing through the endless darkness, its tone dripping with malice and warning. "You should never have come here." "Madam, I'm scared," Chidinma admitted, her voice quivering with fear as she clutched Mrs. Amaka's arm. Mrs. Amaka's grip tightened around the box, her resolve hardening. "We can't stop now, Chidinma. Whatever this is, we have to see it through. We have to find a way out of this nightmare." As they continued to walk, the glow from the box began to pulse, casting fleeting shadows on their path. The ground beneath them felt unstable, as if they were walking on a narrow bridge over an abyss. With every step, the whispers grew more urgent, more insistent, as if trying to lure them into making a fatal mistake. Suddenly, the box in Mrs. Amaka's hands grew unbearably hot, forcing her to drop it. The moment it hit the ground, the glow intensified, and the darkness around them began to shift and ripple, like water disturbed by a stone. From the depths of the shadows, figures began to emerge, pale, ghostly shapes that hovered just beyond the reach of the light. The whispers coalesced into words, forming a message that echoed through the void. "The box is your key, but it also holds your doom. Choose wisely, for the wrong choice will seal your fate." Mrs. Amaka and Chidinma exchanged terrified glances. The pale figures circled them, their hollow eyes fixated on the box, as if waiting for them to make a move. "What do we do, madam?" Chidinma asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Mrs. Amaka stared at the box, its glow flickering like a dying ember. The message was clear. The box held the answers they sought, but it was also a trap, a test of their resolve and their courage. With trembling hands, Mrs. Amaka reached down and opened the box. Inside was a single, small mirror, its surface polished to a perfect sheen. As she lifted the mirror, the ghostly figures paused, their attention now fully focused on the reflective surface. "Look into the mirror," the whispers commanded. "Face your deepest fears, and only then will you find the light." Mrs. Amaka hesitated, fear clawing at her heart. But there was no other choice. Slowly, she raised the mirror to her face and looked into it. At first, she saw nothing but her own reflection, pale and strained with anxiety. But then, the image began to change, warping into something far more terrifying. She saw herself, standing alone in the darkness, surrounded by the same ghostly figures that now circled them. In the reflection, they were closing in on her, their eyes burning with an intense hunger. As she watched in horror, the figures grabbed hold of her reflection, pulling her into the darkness, where she disappeared without a trace. The image was so vivid, so real, that Mrs. Amaka felt a cold hand grip her shoulder in the present, making her jump. But when she looked down, there was nothing there, just the mirror, now showing only her own face once again. "What did you see, madam?" Chidinma asked, her voice trembling with fear. Mrs. Amaka couldn't bring herself to describe it. Instead, she turned the mirror toward Chidinma. "You need to look too," she said, her voice firm despite the fear that still gripped her. Chidinma hesitated, but nodded and took the mirror. She gazed into it, her expression changing from curiosity to terror in an instant. She gasped, her hands shaking as she struggled to keep hold of the mirror. Tears welled up in her eyes, but she didn't look away. After a few agonizing moments, Chidinma lowered the mirror, her face pale. I saw myself, but I was alone. They were all around me, and I couldn't get away. The whispers grew louder, more urgent. You have faced the darkness within, but the true test lies ahead. The light is close, but only one of you can reach it. Choose wisely, for only one path leads to salvation. Mrs. Amaka's heart sank. The choice they had to make was clear, but it was the last thing she wanted to face. The mirror had shown them their greatest fear, being alone, trapped in this darkness forever. And now, the whispers were telling them that only one of them could escape. Madam, Chidinma started, but Mrs. Amaka cut her off. No, Chidinma. You deserve to get out of here. You have your whole life ahead of you. Chidinma shook her head, tears streaming down her face. But madam, I can't leave you here. We have to find another way. Mrs. Amaka smiled sadly, knowing the truth deep down. There was no other way. This was the final test, a test of sacrifice, of who would be willing to let go so the other could live. I'm an old woman, Chidinma, Mrs. Amaka said gently. My time has come. You're young, and you have so much to live for. Take the mirror, find the light, and get out of here. That's my final wish. Chidinma sobbed, shaking her head, but she knew Mrs. Amaka was right. With trembling hands, she took the mirror and held it close to her chest. I'll never forget you, madam, she whispered. Mrs. Amaka nodded, her eyes filling with tears. Go, Chidinma. Be safe and live your life to the fullest. With one last, tearful look at Mrs. Amaka, Chidinma turned and walked toward the light that had appeared in the distance. As she moved away, the ghostly figures parted, allowing her to pass. The light grew brighter, enveloping her in its warmth and pulling her out of the darkness. Mrs. Amaka watched as Chidinma disappeared into the light, her heart heavy with a mix of sorrow and relief. The darkness around her began to close in, the whispers growing softer, more distant, until they faded away entirely. She was alone, just as the mirror had shown her. But she had made her choice, and she knew it was the right one. As the last of the light faded, Mrs. Amaka closed her eyes, embracing the darkness that surrounded her. The ground beneath her feet began to crumble, and she felt herself falling, deeper and deeper into the abyss. But even as she fell, she felt a strange sense of peace, knowing that Chidinma had escaped, that she had made it out alive. And that was enough. Just as the darkness seemed ready to consume her completely, she heard a voice, soft, gentle, and familiar, whispering in her ear. Your journey is not yet over, Amaka. The light still awaits you, if you have the courage to find it. Mrs. Amaka opened her eyes, and for the first time, she saw a glimmer of light in the distance, faint but unmistakable. With renewed determination, she reached out toward it, ready to face whatever lay ahead.